So I guess to return to the book for a moment, I guess some of the book is about all of that. It's about
it is
what can we learn from immigrant communities.
And in Europe and the UK, you've got incredible opportunities to do that. And without being inappropriate, since the end of the Second World War, immigration to the UK, for example, has been talked about in kind of a backhanded way as the Empire Strikes Back. which means, if you can correct me, which means that, and my point here is that what that means is that those that were part of the former empire, the Commonwealth, had the capacity to emigrate to England, and it wasn't economic immigration. In other words, it wasn't just people who were rich. And I think that in Canada, for example, I will not talk for the US, so much of our immigration for the last number of years has been around a system that only lets in people with very high education or very high income. And so the kind of people that you're describing from Africa and other countries who come together to build a different kind of community are less present in Canada. But if for me, the critical source of hope in my country are our First Nations peoples, who have really been the offscouring and the outcasts and uncared for, who are in many ways, and this gets to the practices of the book, in many ways they are deeply rooted in their land and in their place, and they are embracing a spirituality that is not shaped by what I would call postmodern Enlightenment stuff, but by their own roots and stories. And inside of that, they're beginning to thrive. There's one particular person who, I forgot her name now, her name Fraser, who university professor, trained in all the best of the West, who realized that inside that story, as important as it is, she could not live the story of her tradition. And so she returns to the land and she spends, 3 to 4 years with her elders. And her elders walk her around telling the stories of the place where she is. And inside of that is the discovery and the recovery and the resurgence of a whole way of life that in many ways is contrary to the destructiveness of the Western imagination. And I see in that an illustration and actually a picture of the kinds of practices that we as God's people need to pick up. So in the book, for example, we talk about the practice of place. We talk about, some people don't want it to be pushed this far, but like those First Nations peoples, don't get in a car and go to church. Walk about where you belong and where you're rooted and form God's people there. Because so long as I get in a car and go to church, I will never be rooted in place and I will never listen to local. Or another practice that we talk about is how we become a Eucharistic community. So it's no longer shaped around what kind of preaching do you have, what kind of youth programs do you have, what kind of worship band do you have, but how do we form around this critical moment and space of Eucharist. So we began to talk about some of those practices that reroot us in the local and the ordinary.
Now there's another conviction that we haven't got a chapter on, but I think it underlies the book, which is this conviction that something's also happening in the culture.
Right.
So in the middle of the unraveling of a society which is based on this wager that you talk about, the modernist wager, you can live life without God, has come this sense, actually this is no longer working.
Right.
And the beginnings of a searching for something. Now that's not to say that people are going to turn up next Sunday at
no,
church.
Not.
But something's happening, and that gives us cause for hope in the sense of we're knocking at an open door actually, as we begin to listen to what God is up to and begin to discern the places where something fresh is possible. So it's a time of experimentation, it's a time of listening. It's a time of just trying some things to see what might happen. Now, most of these things aren't going to make the headlines. And probably most of these things that we try, we won't be still doing in 5 years' time. But it's actually in the learning from that we'll begin to find and shape the new communities that we're calling God's missional people, if you like,
people,
in a completely new environment, a mission environment, actually. One of the other curious things that we just mentioned briefly in the book is this strange irony that when the modern missions movement began, part of the hope of those who sent those missionaries was that actually one day those that they evangelized and missionized, those who became Christians in other lands, would actually return to Europe.
Yeah, that was there, wasn't it?
It's a curious thing, because at that time there was a desperation about the situation in Europe. That was beginning to signal, do you know what, we need some help. Now, of course, the situation changed in England, and you could argue that that help wasn't needed in the way that those original thinkers like Carey had imagined. But they spoke about this as the hoped for blessed reflex.
Yeah.
It's a bit of an awkward phrase.
Well, it sounds like a stomach disease, but anyway.
But it's an interesting phrase. But curiously, that's exactly what has happened in the end.
Yeah.
It didn't happen when they expected it,
Yeah.
but it's happening now.
Yeah.
And I just think it's one of the wonderful ironies of history.
It is a wonderful thing. And I think it's more the case in UK, Europe,
Yes,
that
it
blessed reflex. But in another way, that blessed reflex really is, I don't want to overstate it, I don't want to romanticize it. It is our First Nations peoples, particularly those who are Christians. We have so much to, rather than saying, how do we help these poor benighted people, which has been the attitude, but how do we learn again to sit at their feet and receive from them is going to be critical. The other thing.